Welcome to another episode. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is there. Feel free to leave a comment, and if you enjoy these calm journeys through time and curiosity, consider subscribing so you can drift along with the next one too. Tonight, we're going to slow down and wander through a few corners of history you might never have visited before. Not the famous dates or the great battles, but the little side alleys of the past. The odd, the forgotten, the moments hiding quietly in the margins. Because sometimes, the most human part of history isn't found in the grand stories, but in the trivia. Let's begin with something you probably touched today. Maybe you stirred your coffee with it, maybe you twirled it absent-mindedly at lunch. A fork. This humble piece of cutlery has been part of human life for centuries, but it wasn't always welcome at the table. In 11th century Venice, the Byzantine princess Theodora Dukaina was mocked and scandalized the locals for using a fork. To them, spearing food with a tiny metal trident was not just unnecessary, it was almost sinful. Clergymen denounced it as an affront to God's gift of fingers. And yet, a few centuries later, forks spread across Europe, slowly replacing knives and spoons for much of dining. By the 18th century, a fork was not only acceptable, but fashionable, especially in France, where etiquette books described the correct way to hold it as if you were conducting a delicate symphony at your plate. Or take the coffee itself. If you had lived in Mecca in the early 1500s, you might never have tasted it because coffee was banned. Religious authorities feared it would encourage radical political gatherings, and they weren't entirely wrong. Coffee houses became hubs for discussion, debate, and occasional conspiracy. In 1675, King Charles II of England even issued a proclamation to shut them down for much the same reason. Too many ideas being exchanged over cups of this dark, stimulating drink. The ban lasted less than 2 weeks. Apparently, Londoners valued their caffeine more than royal decrees. Eyeglasses, another everyday object, appeared in Italy around the late 13th century. But the first ones weren't for reading. They were riveted spectacles, meant for monks, craftsmen, and scholars who needed to see fine detail. And they were often kept secret. Why? Because in a society where age and experience were respected, publicly admitting you couldn't see was admitting to a weakness. It's a reminder that even small technologies can change not just our abilities, but our social fabric. And then there's the umbrella, not just a rain shield, but once a powerful symbol of authority. In ancient China and Egypt, umbrellas were used mainly to block the sun, and only the elite could carry them. In the 18th century, when the first Londoners began carrying umbrellas for rain, they were mocked. One man, Jonas Hanway, became so well known for walking the streets with an umbrella that coach drivers heckled him for trying to put them out of business. He kept walking, and today the umbrella is so unremarkable that we only notice it when it's missing on a rainy day. What's striking about these small histories is how much resistance even the simplest innovations can face. It's easy to imagine that progress is a straight line, a series of inventions that everyone immediately embraces. But often, it's more like a winding path with detours, stubborn opposition, and slow, reluctant acceptance. A fork, a cup of coffee, a pair of glasses, an umbrella. Each of them carried a little storm of controversy in their day. And each of them, in the end, quietly became part of the background of life. If small inventions can quietly shift the course of daily life, then tiny moments, barely noticed at the time, can sometimes tilt the arc of history itself. Not with a bang or a grand proclamation, but with a hesitation, a misstep, or a stroke of pure chance. Take, for example, the year 1914 and the event that lit the fuse for World War I. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. You might imagine it as an efficient, well-executed plot. It was anything but. The first attempt that morning failed. The assassin threw a grenade, but it bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded behind it, injuring bystanders instead. Hours later, the Archduke insisted on visiting the wounded in hospital. On the way, his driver took a wrong turn and stopped to reverse. He had stopped directly in front of a cafe where Gavrilo Princip, another assassin, happened to be standing, perhaps still dazed by the morning's failure. Princip took his chance. One wrong turn, one pause too long, and the course of the 20th century bent toward war. Or consider Napoleon Bonaparte's plans to invade Russia in 1812. Much has been said about the brutal Russian winter, but one curious detail is rarely mentioned: the buttons. The uniforms of Napoleon's soldiers used tin buttons, and tin becomes brittle in extreme cold. Historians have noted that as temperatures plummeted, buttons shattered, coats fell apart, and men were left shivering and exposed to frostbite. You can conquer much of Europe, but you can't fight a war when your coat won't stay closed. The grand strategies of emperors can hinge on the metallurgy of fasteners. In 1835, the United States was free of national debt, the only time in its history. President Andrew Jackson had paid it down aggressively, selling off federal land to do it. It lasted 1 year. By 1837, a financial crisis hit, land values collapsed, and the debt returned. The moment is a reminder that sometimes historical records are brief flashes rather than lasting achievements. And then there's the curious case of the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 in Boston. It sounds almost comical, but it was deadly serious. A massive storage tank burst, sending a wave of molasses 8 meters high, rushing through the streets at 35 miles per hour. 21 people died, buildings were swept away, and horses were literally trapped in hardened syrup. The cause? Poor engineering, ignored safety warnings, and an unusually warm January day that made the molasses more fluid. For years after, locals swore the neighbourhood smelled faintly sweet on hot days. These events don't always make it into school textbooks, but they shape the same tapestry as wars and treaties. History isn't just driven by powerful leaders and sweeping ideologies. Sometimes it's driven by lost directions, broken buttons, speculative land sales, and tanks of molasses. History often remembers people in fixed roles: the explorer, the queen, the inventor, the villain. But life doesn't always follow the script, and sometimes the roles change in ways no one could predict. A king becomes a farmer, a soldier becomes a poet, a pirate becomes a respected governor. Take Sir Henry Morgan. Yes, the same Morgan whose name now decorates bottles of spiced rum. In the 17th century, he was one of the most feared privateers in the Caribbean, raiding Spanish settlements with the official blessing of England. After years of plunder, you might expect his story to end at the gallows or in exile. Instead, he was knighted by King Charles II and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. From outlaw to lawmaker, proof that in certain political climates, a little piracy can be a career builder. Or consider Jean Bedel Bokassa, who ruled the Central African Republic in the 1970s and crowned himself emperor, complete with a coronation inspired by Napoleon's. Lavish is an understatement. His crown alone cost millions of dollars. And yet, after his fall from power, Bokassa returned to his homeland quietly, living out his final years as a farmer. From imperial robes to a straw hat, the arc of history is rarely subtle. Even in the world of science, unexpected turns abound. George Washington Carver, often remembered for his work with peanuts, was originally interested in art. He applied to an art school and was accepted, until they discovered he was black, and rescinded the offer. Carver pivoted to agricultural science, revolutionizing farming techniques in the American South. It's impossible to say what kind of artist he might have been, but his second act changed the soil and the economy for millions. And then there's the curious case of Anthony Hopkins. Not the actor, but the composer of a waltz that went unheard for 50 years. Hopkins had written it as a young man, tucked it away, and gone on to a long career as an actor. Decades later, his waltz was finally performed by André Rieu to a stadium full of people. Sometimes history's detours aren't about power or war, but about the quiet patience of a dream waiting for its moment. We like to imagine that history moves in straight lines, the hero's journey from beginning to end. But in truth, it's more like a winding road with unexpected turn-offs. And perhaps that's why these odd careers and sudden transformations feel so alive. They remind us that even the people who seem fixed in the past were, in the end, still human, capable of surprise. For all our modern faith in science and medicine, it's worth remembering that the road to knowledge has been a winding, sometimes absurd one. We didn't get here through a clean sequence of brilliant breakthroughs. We stumbled, guessed, experimented, and, occasionally, wandered off into the utterly bizarre. Consider mummy powder. In Europe from the Middle Ages through the 17th century, ground-up Egyptian mummies were sold as medicine. The logic was tenuous at best. Ancient bodies, preserved for thousands of years, must contain some sort of mystical life force. Apothecaries prescribed it for everything from headaches to internal bleeding. It was so popular that when the supply of actual mummies ran low, unscrupulous merchants simply made fake ones, drying out recently deceased bodies and selling them as ancient. This wasn't fringe quackery either. It was mainstream. Doctors, kings and merchants all bought into it, quite literally. Then there's the curious case of electric therapy in the 18th and 19th centuries. After the discovery of electricity's effects on muscle movement, inventors began selling electrotherapy devices, promising to cure everything from paralysis to depression. Some were harmless quack gadgets, little more than a mild tingle. Others could deliver shocks strong enough to knock you over. One particularly dubious machine promised to restore male vitality through targeted electrical stimulation, a phrase that should set off alarm bells in any century. Not all strange science was useless, of course. In 1928, Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to find that a petri dish of Staphylococcus bacteria had been contaminated by a mold, and the mold had killed the bacteria around it. Penicillin was born, not through a grand plan, but because Fleming had been a bit messy and, frankly, lucky. It was a reminder that accidents are sometimes the best research assistants. And then there's the matter of lobotomies. In the early to mid-20th century, this procedure, severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, was promoted as a miracle cure for mental illness. Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz even won a Nobel Prize for developing it. But the human cost was devastating. Thousands left with severe cognitive and emotional impairments, their personalities altered beyond recognition. The practice eventually fell out of favour, but not before leaving a grim footnote in medical history. The path from superstition to science is messy. For every life-saving discovery, there are dozens of strange detours, hopeful dead ends, and well-meaning disasters. Looking back, it's easy to laugh at powdered mummies and electric belts, but perhaps the real lesson is that we, too, are likely living with medical ideas that future generations will find ridiculous. Some parts of history are never truly gone. They lie buried, under sand, under water, under centuries of forgetting, until one day they reappear, as if to remind us that the past is never finished speaking. Take the Rosetta Stone. In 1799, during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, a group of French soldiers digging near the town of Rosetta uncovered a dark slab of granite inscribed with strange symbols. What they had found, without knowing it, was the key to understanding ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, a script that had been silent for over 1,000 years. It wasn't magic, just the right combination. The same text repeated in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. It would take scholars like Jean-François Champollion 2 decades to crack the code, all because a stone happened to be reused as building material in an old fort wall, or the Antikythera mechanism, discovered in 1901 by sponge divers off the coast of a small Greek island. At first, it looked like a lump of corroded bronze. Only later did researchers realise it was a 2,000-year-old device, a complex set of gears that could predict astronomical events with astonishing accuracy. Some call it the world's first analogue computer. Its existence forces us to rethink what the ancient world was capable of. Then there are the Dead Sea Scrolls, found in the late 1940s by a Bedouin shepherd looking for a lost goat. Inside a cave, he found clay jars holding ancient manuscripts, some over 2,000 years old, containing texts from the Hebrew Bible and other writings from the Second Temple period. For centuries, they had been hidden away, perfectly preserved by the desert's dry air. It's almost poetic that such fragile words survived while the civilizations that wrote them did not. And sometimes, what's rediscovered isn't a grand artifact, but a glimpse into everyday life. In Pompeii, ash from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE froze moments in time. Bread still in ovens, graffiti on walls, a dog curled up as if asleep. Archaeologists are still uncovering new rooms, new streets, and new details about how ordinary Romans lived and thought. It's history not in the form of emperors and armies, but of bakeries and bedrooms. These discoveries remind us that the past is not a closed book. It's a library with shelves we haven't reached yet, and every so often, by accident or persistence, we open another door. Sometimes the quirks of history aren't about grand inventions or lost relics, they're about the rules people lived by. Rules that today feel absurd, but at the time were enforced with absolute seriousness. In 16th century England, for example, it was illegal to eat meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, not for religious reasons, but because the government wanted to support the fishing industry. Breaking the rule could get you fined. It's a strange kind of patriotism, not waving a flag, but eating cod to help the economy. Or the beard tax of the 17th century Russia. When Tsar Peter the Great returned from a trip to Western Europe, he decided his country needed to modernize, starting with the faces of his subjects. Men who insisted on keeping their beards had to pay a tax and carry a small copper token as proof of payment. The coin bore the inscription, "The beard is a superfluous burden." It's perhaps the only time in history that facial hair came with paperwork. Even stranger is the walking backwards rule of 19th century Japan. When Commodore Perry of the United States visited in 1854 to open trade, Japanese protocol dictated that no one should turn their back on the shogun. So after an audience, officials would exit by walking backwards the entire way, no matter how far the corridor. One imagines more than a few bruised shins in the name of respect. Rules like these tell us as much about a society's priorities as any law book. They reveal what leaders wanted to control and what citizens were willing to accept, however ridiculous it might seem now. Sometimes history hides its humour in the margins. Moments when the seriousness of the past cracks open just enough for a laugh to slip through. Take the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. Its ash cloud led to what became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed, people starved, and, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. But less well known is that across Europe, desperate farmers tried feeding their cattle strange substitutes, including ground-up fish and sawdust, in a bid to keep them alive. It did not end well. Or consider the time in 897 when Pope Stephen VI put his predecessor, Pope Formosus, on trial. Not metaphorically, literally. They dug up Formosus's corpse, dressed it in papal robes, propped it on a throne, and interrogated it. The cadaver synod ended with the corpse declared guilty, stripped of its robes, and thrown into the Tiber River. Even in the often theatrical politics of the Middle Ages, this was unusual. And then there's the time in 1904 when the Russian Navy mistook a fleet of British fishing boats for Japanese warships and opened fire in the North Sea. The confusion sparked an international incident, several injuries, and one unfortunate sinking of a fishing trawler full of herring. It turns out even trained navies aren't immune to a case of mistaken identity. While many historical figures are remembered for their great achievements, some are remembered for accidents, unplanned contributions that shaped the world. In 1853, an American chef named George Crumb got a complaint from a diner who said his fried potatoes were too thick. In frustration or inspiration, Crumb sliced them paper thin, fried them crisp, and salted them heavily. The customer loved them. Potato chips were born. In 1945, Percy Spencer, an engineer working on radar equipment, noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted. He realized microwaves could heat food, and within 2 years, the first microwave oven was on the market. It was almost as tall as a person and weighed about 750 pounds, which perhaps explains why it didn't become an instant household hit. Even the match, a small, everyday miracle, was discovered by accident in 1826 when chemist John Walker scraped a stick coated with chemicals across his hearth and saw it flare. The smell was apparently awful, but the spark was enough to light an entire industry. These chance discoveries remind us that history is not always shaped by intention. Sometimes it's just a matter of paying attention when something unexpected happens, and knowing how to turn it into an opportunity. The food on our plates can carry some of history's strangest stories. Meals have sparked revolutions, toppled leaders, and sometimes saved lives. In 1765, a failed French grain harvest sent bread prices skyrocketing. For the poor, bread was not a luxury. It was survival. The resulting unrest fed into the anger that eventually boiled over in the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette almost certainly never said, "Let them eat cake," but the bread riots were very real. Meanwhile, in 19th century India, a rumour spread that new rifle cartridges supplied by the British were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The outrage led to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. It's a reminder that something as simple as food, or even the idea of it, can ignite far more than hunger. On a lighter note, the sandwich owes its name to John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, who in the 18th century reportedly asked for meat served between slices of bread so he could eat without leaving the gambling table. Convenience food born from stubborn dedication to the game. And then there are the mysteries that still resist explanation, the trivia that refuses to be solved. The Voynich manuscript, discovered in 1912, is a book filled with strange illustrations of plants that don't exist, astronomical diagrams, and text in an unknown language. Scholars, cryptographers, even codebreakers from World War II have tried to decipher it. No one has succeeded. It's either a masterwork of coded genius, or a centuries-old prank on a monumental scale, or the dancing plague of 1518, when dozens of people in Strasbourg began dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some collapsed from exhaustion, some reportedly died. The cause? Theories range from ergot fungus poisoning to mass hysteria, but no consensus exists. Even the Great Fire of London in 1666 leaves unanswered questions. We know it started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, but not exactly how it spread so fast. Some blamed foreign saboteurs, others divine punishment. In truth, it may have simply been the perfect storm of wooden buildings, narrow streets, and a stiff wind. History is full of mysteries like these, not grand unsolved crimes or secret conspiracies, but strange ripples in the fabric of the past. They linger because they invite us to wonder. Some of history's most fascinating moments happen at sea, where human ambition meets the unpredictable force of water. In 1703, Britain was struck by what is still considered its worst storm in recorded history. Winds reached over 80 miles per hour, and thousands of sailors were lost. The storm was so shocking that famed writer Daniel Defoe published an entire book documenting eyewitness accounts, a kind of early disaster journalism. Or the curious fate of the SS Waratah, known as the Titanic of the South. In 1909, this passenger liner vanished off the coast of South Africa with more than 200 people aboard. Despite extensive searches, no trace has ever been found. Theories range from sudden storms to a freak rogue wave, but the sea has kept its secret. And then there's the tale of the Essex, a whaling ship rammed and sunk by a sperm whale in 1820. The survivor's desperate ordeal inspired Herman Melville to write Moby Dick. It's proof that sometimes the truth is even stranger and harsher than fiction. War is often remembered in terms of battles and treaties, but the smaller stories, the human details, often reveal more about its strange reality. During World War II, the British government considered dropping propaganda leaflets over Germany printed on toilet paper, betting that they'd be impossible for civilians to throw away. The plan never took off, but it's hard not to imagine the impact of such a delivery. In the same war, the Allies created an entire fake army, complete with inflatable tanks, dummy planes, and false radio chatter, to convince the Germans that the D-Day invasion would happen in a completely different location. It worked. Thousands of German troops were left guarding the wrong beaches, and in 1788 the Austrian army managed to kill itself. In the Battle of Caronsebe's, soldiers, already on edge, mistook one another for the enemy in the dark. Panic spread, shots were fired, and by morning hundreds were dead, without the enemy ever arriving. Animals have been part of human history in ways both noble and absurd. Consider Wojtek, a Syrian brown bear who served with the Polish army in World War II. The soldiers adopted him as a cub, and he learned to carry artillery shells during battle. When the war ended, Wojtek retired to the Edinburgh Zoo, where he lived out his days as a minor celebrity. Or Cher Ami, a homing pigeon who, in 1918, saved nearly 200 soldiers of the US Army's Lost Battalion by delivering a message through enemy fire, even after being shot and losing an eye. Cher Ami was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for bravery. And then there's the curious medieval belief in trial by animal. Pigs, goats, and even insects were sometimes put on trial for crimes ranging from property damage to, in one famous case, murder. The outcomes were rarely favourable for the accused. Sometimes the past leaves us stories so improbable they sound like urban legends, except they're true. In 1325, two Italian city-states, Modena and Bologna, went to war over a stolen bucket. Yes, an actual wooden bucket. The War of the Bucket lasted for months, claimed thousands of lives, and ended with Modena keeping the bucket as a trophy. It's still on display today, or the time in 1519 when Hernán Cortés scuttled his own ships after landing in Mexico, forcing his men to march inland with no hope of retreat. It was a psychological move meant to ensure commitment. The phrase, "burn the ships," still survives as a metaphor for total dedication, though technically he sank them. And in 1932, Australia fought and lost a war against emus. After crops were ravaged by the giant birds, soldiers were sent to thin their numbers. The emus proved faster, more agile, and surprisingly resistant to machine gun fire. Eventually, the military gave up and the emus simply went back to being emus. Our journey ends with a look at the sheer persistence of human curiosity, the small acts that add colour to history. In 1969, when Apollo 11 astronauts landed on the moon, they carried with them a small silicon disc etched with goodwill messages from leaders around the world. It's still up there, somewhere in the lunar dust. In the 18th century, Benjamin Franklin once wrote a satirical essay suggesting that scientists develop a drug to make farts smell pleasant, perhaps like perfume. It was a joke, but also a jab at the scientific establishment's obsession with impractical inventions. And in 1901, an English amateur archaeologist named Arthur Evans began excavating the ruins of Knossos in Crete. What he found, the remains of the Minoan civilization, revealed a culture that had been entirely forgotten for millennia. It was a reminder that even an individual's curiosity can rewrite what we think we know about the past.